and I will present something that I'm working on now. Actually, it's a subject that I'm working about for many, many years, and now I'm starting to collect all the things and the point of views that I was working on into another one, okay, into first of all, wrapping everything together and like taking a look at everything. So this is what I'm presenting now. I divided the presentation into 6 small points. The first 3 will explain the idea, the general idea, and origins to this idea, and then the last third will be discussing various points of view that are affected by this idea. So this is how it will work. Of course, if you want to ask me something, if you want to add something, don't hesitate. I will be happy to be interrupted. Okay, so the initial point says that throughout the history of the built environment, its development was subjected in various cultures to abstract principles and codes that were deduced from religious ideas, from cultural ideas, from climatological terms, from various points of view. For example, I will present some of the information that we have about these past codes that existed for many, many years. For example, the BEN-GURION has a very thorough research regarding the coding that existed in Mediterranean cities for many, many years, since the early year of the 5th century until well into the 22nd to the 20th century, until like the middle of the 20th century. He claims that specific rules existed in various Middle Eastern places that were regarding a lot of small subjects of conduct regarding the development of the built environment. For example, the idea that you have a Sabbath or a fina, which is near the external wall of the house, that you can use it in various ways. The fact that people could, in various situations, agree between themselves that they would build a private area above the public passage of the city. This is something that is really existing in a lot of Mediterranean areas. You know it in Italy, I know it in Arab cities in Israel, and all over the Mediterranean. Again, the idea of the fina, that you can use the small area around the building. Many rules that related to other issues as well, to blocking the view, to opening a new door to the street. How should it be posed? A lot of things, and the BEN-GURION tells us about the way that these rules, first of all, were accumulated, sometimes were literally written in books of law, and how they developed and ran from place to place throughout Middle East and the Mediterranean, and the way that they were developed and adopted into the legal systems of a lot of cities and cultures around the Mediterranean, and the way that they, in a way, sometimes still exist in areas and in cities in the Middle East. So it's really a thorough research, and this book from 2010 is really describing how small, sometimes conflicts between neighbors, between authorities and neighbors, and how these conflicts created newer decisions and newer rules, and refined the rules and the way that they actually developed. For example, looking at Middle Eastern cities in Libya, you can see that there is sort of a rule or a way of conduct that is taking place. I would be glad to send everybody the PowerPoint presentation. It's free. I will leave it on the computer, and then you can share it with everybody. I took it from National Geographic site. They have so beautiful photos of them. So you can see this order that exists. People know how to build a certain building, that they leave the small open space within this patio, within the building, and whether they relate to other buildings, and etc. etc. There is not a plan, but there is a rule, there is a code, there is an abstract principle that is organizing the built environment. There is a very interesting researcher named Wendy Ashmore. She investigated the Mayan cities in the middle of and the south of the Americas, and she discovered that what she found as a special expression of both cosmology, maybe ideas, abstract ideas, and religious guidance, and of course politics, that constituted the relations between elements in built areas that she found in Maya culture. She didn't find documents, of course, but then what she could do is to analyze the remains, and she found a very clear what she called a patterning, spatial patterning that existed in those cities. Even in places where sheer top-to-bottom planning and development existed, there were situations in which codes and abstract guidance emerged from the top, from the bottom to the top. For example, in the top-to-bottom massive event of Haussmann constructing Paris, there were very clear rules. It was all about a single group of people that were deciding how to create the city. According to Peter Hall, there were about 27,000. It's always difficult with numbers. I don't know why. Words okay, numbers no. So it was 27,000 buildings were destructed in this period between 1850 and you've seen numbers yourself. So, okay, but about 100,000 new buildings were constructed at the same time. So there was a very top-to-bottom plan, but when the new buildings were built, and of course there were also ruling about the new buildings, about the decoration of the new buildings. But Peter Hall specifically mentions that the inner of the house were not ordered, only the outside of the building were ordered. Nevertheless, there was emerging a certain Parisian style, that every building was answering this code or abstract principle of how to build a house, and although the buildings were not really similar, they all were applying or relating to the same rule. So much so that in a newspaper in the middle of the 19th century, there was appeared this cartoon or section of painting of a section of a Parisian house that again existed in Peter Hall's book, defining the vertical segregation that existed in a Parisian house. This segregation was emerging like a code, like an abstract code that everybody were obeying without a specific rule that decided that this is the way. But in an almost autonomous way, very spontaneous way, the upper classes were located at the second and the third floor, and the middle classes and the lower classes, everybody had a certain place in this very sheer top-to-bottom environment. A very clear bottom-up rule emerged throughout history. So we discussed Ashmore's researchers about spatial patterning in the Maya cities. There is a research by Logan describing German cities, and the books of rules that existed in German cities before the zoning era at the end of the 19th century, of the 20th century, when they started to of the 19th century, when they decided to start zoning, then they had to deal with a lot of codes that were written, specific codes that were written, and they were not map-based. They were abstract principles of building and planning elements in German cities. And of course, in Italian, this tradition of non-mapped and non-specific regulations that affected the development of cities in many European places, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Germany, and so on and so forth. So it was, in a way, a common culture that developed almost spontaneously all over the places where cities and built environments were developed, where clear cultural and clear religious stipulation affected the way that the built environment should be created. And there was this kind of language. And of course, as we all know, that we lost, in a way, this culture and history of coding when we actually adopted, I mean the humankind, it's not us specifically, of course, but the humankind, when we adopted this way of planning. I'm just presenting you a plan from Israel, but it doesn't matter. You know this type of working. You say this will be here, this will be there. Every color means another, a different land use, etc., etc. So we are now working in plan-led regulatory planning that is actually developing or still working, operating, although we know that it is not the very best way to deal with planning regulation, but nevertheless it is almost impossible to get out of this system, and it is still operating in most of EU countries, in the US, in Japan, in Australia, and I can also testify for Israel that although it is a very problematic way of regulating, it is still operating. And as a very stimulating idea wrote by Stefano sitting here is that we are looking at a transition to an end-state control device, aiming at ordering the action, the specific actions of people instead of just regulating them, okay? Telling people what to do, where to do, exactly which kind of element to build everywhere instead of just regulating them and allowing this spontaneous coding to emerge. So that is the democracy idea, but I'm sure that most of you already heard about it. So I want to add another layer to this understanding of codes and the way that they develop or the way that they were applied to the built environment, to the planning of the built environment. Then I go to Christopher Alexander, that I'm sure that all of you have heard about his idea. And first of all, I want to start with the division that he makes between cities which have arisen more or less spontaneously over many, many years. He calls them natural cities, and shall call those cities and parts of city which have been deliberately created by designers and planners in what we call a plan-led system. He defines them as artificial cities. And a lot of writing and in a way, Christopher Alexander invested his whole career to defining this division between the natural and the artificial. And the natural, which is in a way an expression of culture, of people's understanding, knowledge, accumulated knowledge, and the design, the artificial, which is actually ordering people according to the knowledge which is concentrated at a certain planning team or a certain group of planners that collect all the knowledge and order the knowledge to other peoples. And the relevance is that Christopher Alexander is relating to the result of the architectural result, the urban result that he faces, and says to us that this result is extremely different. When we look at the natural cities and look at the artificial cities, the result is crucially different. Okay, this is one point. But again, going to those natural cities, Christopher Alexander names this natural city as if having equality without a name. He doesn't give it a name, but he says that this quality cannot be made, okay, by a specific planner or a specific group, but only generated, okay, indirectly, it is important, by the actions of the people. It is indirectly, and there is something that is standing behind this indirect action, and this is what Christopher Alexander names the pattern language. I'm sure that many of you know Christopher Alexander's work, and this pattern language is something that he is really developing in many books and papers that he is writing, and about this, the way this pattern language is actually the way that new elements are built and added to the built environment. The thing is, though, that Christopher Alexander is saying very little about the way that the mechanism of applying saying very little about the mechanism of applying codes to planning. How do we use this pattern language? How do we use these abstract codes that exist and this knowledge that exists? How do we use it in practice when we want to add a new building, when we want to add a new store to an existing building, when we want to enlarge an element? What do we do? How do we apply these codes? So there is some way of a romantic vision that is expressed through the work of Christopher Alexander. He says that within this framework of a common language, okay, pattern language, millions of individuals acts on a building, on buildings will together generate a town which is alive. It will together grow and be alive and whole and unpredictable without control. Now, without control is my stress, but it is his words still, okay? Without control, as if we have this language, no control is needed. This is something that I'm not sure about. I mean, I'm not sure it is relevant in our days, in our times, and this is something that I would like to challenge. It is a process, again, Alexander, which brings order out of nothing but ourselves. It cannot be attained, but it will happen on its own accord, if we only let it, as if it's something that we only need the code in order to have it running automatically. And this is, of course, not enough. We know that it is not enough. We sense the fact that it is not enough because we are living in a world where every stone over stone has a meaning, has economic meaning, social meaning, you name it, okay? We cannot have this code, abstract code, operating without a specific procedure to apply this code. So some knowledge about the way that the mechanism of applying code actually existed is provided by a very interesting book almost 30 years ago by Jamal Akbar. The name of the book is Crisis in the Built Environment. Very, very interesting, and I really recommend this amazing book because it is all built upon this question of how really the mechanism of applying code existed. So according to Akbar, in Middle Eastern cities that he knows really well, and he investigated really well, it is a result of the negotiations between three parties. The ownership, the person or the people or the body who owns an asset, it could be a land, it could be a building, the owner, those who control it, those who have the right and the force to permit building or changing a building or whatever, the control, and and those who actually use the building. So he analyzes the relationship, and he says that the negotiations between these three parties, with the codes and the stipulations and the abstract principles at the back, of course we have to use them, they are explaining the way that buildings and cities are actually built in the Middle East. This is his thesis, and I really find it really interesting. Much more than this, Jamal Akbar is defining 5 different patterns of negotiations, or terms in which the negotiation takes place. For example, there is a way which Jamal Akbar is calling it unified. Unified means that the same body, the same people, the same entity, both own, control, and use the element. For example, if I have a home, I have a house, I am the owner, I'm the controller, I'm the user. Okay, then, for example, this is of course not applying to modern places, because also we have the house, we are not those who control, but nevertheless, okay? And there is a way the trust chip when the owner and the user, okay, are the same, but the control is over something else, and the dispersed when there are 3 different bodies, the submissive, the possessive, and the relationship between these elements are different in every case, and the negotiations with the kind of codes and abstract principles at the back, the negotiations are the result, and they explain the new order in the built environment. Now, this point is specifically interesting, because what Jamal Akbar is telling us about Middle Eastern cities is that everything had to be agreed. I mean, if you wanted to build something new, or you wanted to change something that exists, you needed to gain the agreement of those around you. It could be your neighbors, and it could be I don't know, the mayor or the authority of, or the head of the clan, or the religious person, but someone had to agree upon this situation. And the agreement, the pattern of agreement, is something that Jamal Akbar is really researching and investigating in this book. Much more than this, according to Akbar's idea, it is first of all, reaching the often implicit agreement between the owners and the adjacent neighbors is a necessary issue before getting a permission to build or to do something in the built environment. But much more than this, it is the negotiation between them that have an effect on the rules themselves. The rules change, the rules evolve, the rules are all the time alive, because people all the time discuss it in various frameworks that he describes. And it is important because it is, according to his perception, it is this transition from the direct negotiation and the mutual agreement of neighbors into the modern pattern of agreeing, which is much more like the bottom up, having the need to get the permission from the authorities and not to negotiate between one another. This is the source of the crisis in the built environment, according to his saying. Because people don't need to negotiate, they don't need to apply knowledge. Now every user has to get the permission of the authority. So it's much simpler way of discussing, and mutual agreement is not a player here anymore. So all the pattern of responsibility that Jamal Akbar is building upon is suddenly collapsed, and this leads, according to his saying, to a crisis in the built environment. Okay, so the idea of mutual understanding, and I was looking for it in other places well. For example, I found one again, coming back to Paris, in this sheer top to bottom experience of Paris in the middle of the 19th century. For example, Pinot discusses the creation of Boulevard Saint-Germain, saying that owner and neighbors were meeting together to arrange between them the construction of the îlot, which is sort of an island in the road, so that the floors would be of the same height, and that the patterns will be similar, so that there will be created a very nice place on the road. So again, we see this mutual agreement arriving here and there, and there are also other places when we see the mechanism of getting mutual agreement, of discussing between the planners, which are the people who live in an area. These planners discuss each other, and they have the background of the absolute code, and they discuss upon those codes and make decisions between themselves. And the idea of mutual agreement is a very crucial point so maybe we can just now say something about two important conclusions. First of all, that negotiation between relevant parties prior to building new elements were an essential part of planning, of applying planning codes and abstract principles to the creation of the built environment. Okay, it was a very essential part. Without it, the codes would mean nothing. And the other conclusion is, again, adopting Jamal Akbar's idea, is that it is the withdrawal from the method of mutual agreement and replacing it with the need to obtain the permission from the authorities, from the planning authorities. That is the cause to the crisis in the built environment, to the fact that we have no mutual language in the built environment. But it is not enough, because we know that today mutual understanding, the way that it existed in the past, is irrelevant. I mean, we cannot discuss our neighbors. We don't live any longer in those type of cultures. Well, first of all, our culture is not unified. We are very diverse. This world is globalized. People come and invest from out of the country. They don't speak your language, but they can buy the asset or the building next to you and build something. There is no way to bridge these gaps through negotiations. So we need to find a way to negotiate, okay, between ourselves and make decisions with having an abstract code, maybe this or another, at the back of our system, and to make decisions. How can we discuss in a public way and take into account codes, abstract codes that exist, and take decisions at the end of this discussion? How do we do it in a liberal, democratic, very pluralistic society? So I say that we have this institution actually already built in our society, and it's a not a new institution, but we need maybe to adopt it and to learn from this institution and to use it for planning. So the liberal democratic way, should I say also pluralistic way, to achieve mutual agreements. We have a growing interest that we see already in the application of planning codes. It appears in a very long series of writings about codes in the last few years, and going to a tendency to adopt codes and abstract principles as a regulatory device in various countries, in Europe, in the United States. we see this. For example, we see the American Smart Growth and the form-based codes that are expanding throughout the United States. We see the consolidation of the British planning policy statements into a national planning policy framework. Only recently, some way to condense all the various codes into a more condensed line of principles. I can testify about the Israeli, which is also in a way struggling into making statutory policy papers from the national outline plans instead of having them using the land use system, having them working like statutory policy papers is another thing that is already operating. We also see academic interest in codes, city rules from the American point of view, and another is Eran Ben Yosef, also American writer, Israeli-American writing about the code of the city, and a lot of writings. So I will just shortly present the model that is actually historically, truly, the model existed before everything else, because this is something that I'm working on and according to for many years. So I'm saying, just if we want planning to operate as a place for regulating plans in liberal, democratic, and pluralistic society, then we need to follow the principles of liberal, pluralistic society and divide between those who make the plan, the codes, the qualitative planning codes, which is the legislature, some kind of people that are maybe elected representatives that make the rules. But mostly I want to concentrate on the judiciary, which is actually using the codes and applying public policy, which is again an abstract thing, and making decisions about planning applications. So again, this is the place for an arena for discussing plans. Just imagine a place that planners, private or public, submit their applications, and where we have an open judiciary that discusses these applications. But unlike our already existing commissions that I'm sure that also in Italy are operating, this judiciary is not nominated by the city, by the government. It is not part of an executive authority that is already operating, like we have, for example, in Israel. We have a planning authority, and it has commissions. But thank you. But this commission is also responsible to supply housing. It is also entitled to, if it is at the local level, it is also entitled to the performance of the city. Just imagine that it is an independent body that is accepting the view of the city, of the government, of the various people, and discusses these codes independently of all the related bodies that are affected, of course, by the plans. Like the city is affected, the people are affected, NGOs have a lot to say about this. Maybe urban localities has a lot to say about this. Maybe various governmental bodies has a lot to say about this. Let's hear them all about a specific plan and discuss it independently. So just imagine that we have this. I don't want to, because it's not, I'm not presenting something that is already done and complete. Okay, let's just imagine that we have something that is independently simply discussing plans and making decisions after all the bodies that you already know have decided on them. Just imagine. So now let's briefly say what could this help us, or how could this help us? So I would say three issues that are already not working in land use planning and could work if we had this system of A, coding, B, mutual agreement mechanism. Then, if we had this, we, first of all, would be able to tackle the idea of spontaneous order, because this is something which is crucial. We don't have a planning system today that is compatible with the idea of complexity, because we think about and we operate about planning in a way that we are planning a very closed and final product. But the city is not final. It is never final. It is not a static solution. It is dynamic. So if you apply the idea of complexity into land use planning, and you compare land use planning, which is the orthodox top to bottom planning idea, and you compare it to the code-based plan that existed once, but in a more updated, modern, liberal, democratic way, then you would see that the code-based system enables us to look at the city not as a closed, as a static solution, like the land use plan that I showed you before, but as an open system. It's not static, it is dynamic, because we don't relate to the end state, but we all the time add new elements to the city. After the plan is made, the plan that you made tomorrow is already amending this one, so we don't need to amend. And it is not based on prediction, because we agree that it is not predictable, so we don't need to make predictions. We have rules to conduct the relations between elements. And we actually, I'm maybe not really planning my time really good, because I'm not going to go into very deep into the examples, but just to say in brief that recently we have finished a research about Arab Palestinian towns in Israel. And the interesting thing about Arab Palestinian towns in Israel is that the planning system, the Israeli planning system, was almost irrelevant for them. I mean, land use planning did not work in these places, and because of many political issues. And the thing that really worked in the last almost 70 years that the state of Israel is existing, the thing that already worked there is a kind of sort of a code, cultural code between people that led into the development of their built environment. And there, although it is really not a very, sometimes really deprived areas, but still it has the quality of an emerging and open system that is operating. And this research has shown how the development of various areas was advanced, and the way that it was created in times. I'm sorry, left the Hebrew here. And this research showed how agreements regarding the relations between elements at various scales has actually led into the creation of specific built environment in various places, until the level where plans were no longer created by people, but they were top-down, like in this case of newer neighborhoods in our Palestinian places, where the suburban code of modern planning was enforced on these areas, but it did not exist before. Okay, so this is the analysis, and this way of planning with codes enabled the creation creation of a long hierarchy, of a wide hierarchy of public spaces, from the most public to the most private, which were in a way regulated by the codes, by the cultural codes, etc., etc. So I'm not really enabling this. I know that it is too short to discuss this, but I'm just saying that coding is the gate into adapting planning to the idea of complexity. But two other ideas. First of them is the poor performance of land use planning, because we all know that land use planning is not really working the way it should be. Cities and built areas are not really planned and built according to the way the planning are ordering them to develop. And in recent years, we have a long list of researchers that deal with the gap between planning and what is actually created. And part of it is because that, as we know, people don't really obey these land use planning, not only in Israel or Italy, but also in more strict places like the United States and other places, because in a way, plans are actually operating like deals. Like each plan to construct a building or a new neighborhood or a new factory is in a way a deal. A deal between a developer, a specific developer with interest, and the local government with its interest. And we are hoping that plans would regulate those deals, when in fact all the deals in our society, all the deals in our economic system are regulated by abstract codes, like it was in the past. Okay? Also in the past, plans were actually deals, but then we had a clear mechanism of discussing and clear mechanism of deciding upon each plan, and like the one that Jamal Akbar displayed and other. So maybe here is the fault. We hope to regulate deals with plans and not with rules, which is a very problematic issue. And we see that planning is adopting a flexible way of operating, and we know that plans are conducted and then we ask for flexibility to amend the plans, and this is why we have all these distortions between the original plan and what is actually built. And this is leading us again to the inspiration of Stefano, which is public and planning the rule of law. Because we, as I want to claim, is that in planning codes we have the ability to amend the policies of land use planning regarding the inconsistency of planning with the basic principles of democracy, of freedom and democracy. So if we have rules and if we have a sound decision-making arena which is independent, then we have the beginning of a structure that could help us plan and make planning much more just, impartial, public, and honest idea that is defending each and every one of us. But it is crucial that we have this independent body at the back of this system. So I'm talking about urban planning codes in a way that are shared by all actors in the built areas, in the built environment, including public institutions that today we don't know exactly to who they are subjected. We're talking about planning, which is basically operated like in the past on a case by case. When we have a developer that is interested in doing something, it could be building a building, could be making a road, an underground, and university, whatever should be according to specific codes between what is already existing and the thing that you want to add. So we want to keep this case-by-case dynamic because it is the only way that cities should develop, but we need codes at the background where they are not coerced and amended to fit local interests, but only according to an impartial body that is this judiciary that I'm talking about. And I want to say that it is the only way in which planning code could in themselves form a living body, which is not fixed forever, but it is all the time amending with technology, with knowledge, with changing values, with changing opportunities and circumstances. Then we could maybe see these codes not as a fixed line of stipulation, but as something that is much more alive. And so, again, I'm coming back to this model of means to apply planning codes to remedy the problems of the existing problems of land use plan. And I want to leave it here, maybe for discussion. So thank you.
Thank you very much, NURIT.
Thank you.
Question, comments?
I thought about 40 minutes, but I did almost 50, so.
Basically, this last slide